It's always a shame to me when I sit down to watch some kind of undervalued horror or thriller, whatever the case may be, and it's a victim of, as I've said before for a couple of films, especially recently, its own marketing. Where whoever was hired to do the cover art of the DVD, or the poster for the movie, or even the title of the film just clearly wasn't inspired. They have boring DVD covers or bland, generic names, and there are so many films that unfortunately fall into that very category, and it's almost like their own undoing, because you can have a genuinely great movie that just doesn't do that well because people have no reason to go and see it, or no reason to want even to go and see it. Now, to me, this was definitely one of those occasions, because the only reason why I even picked up this movie in the first place is because I happened to see it going cheap in a DVD store. So I thought, sure, why not? It was like 50 pence, so I picked it up. It was a generic looking film. It's called Wilderness. The cover art is just dark with the outline of a dog's teeth. Wow, how creative. And yet when you actually put on the film, which I finally did, it's so much better than that. And it angers me when whoever is in charge of that kind of stuff clearly just doesn't put the effort in, because with a simple rename and new cover art, you could have made this movie into exactly what it should be, which is a survival, thriller, horror classic. Now, this movie, when you start the film, could initially make you feel like you've put in the wrong DVD, or maybe the wrong one was in the box, because the start of the film is nothing like what the title, what the cover, and what the synopsis would have you believe that it's going to be about. I mean, it's called Wilderness, there are teeth on the front, so you're probably expecting the wilderness with some teeth involved, and yet the film opens in a prison, and you're like, wait a second, what's going on here? And it's actually great, and I liked that juxtaposition of a prison-esque movie, but turning into a survival horror thriller, in a similar way, actually, to how I also enjoyed, I can't recall if it was either the third or the fourth installment in the Wrong Turn franchise, but the third or the fourth one, I can't recall which, revolves more around a bus full of convicts who end up in that horror scenario, and it's by far the best film of the franchise, as far as I'm concerned, including the first one. This is a similar kind of concept, where you have a group of these young offenders in a prison, one of whom is Toby Kebbell, in a very early performance of his, and I would have to say my favourite of his that I've seen so far, and I have seen A Monster Calls as well, but I really enjoyed his performance in this one, and the way the story pans out, it makes sense. It's how do you get from a prison to a wilderness and feel justified, and yet it does. Because to lay out the simple, overarching idea of the story, basically this group of young offenders, as you'd expect, they're not the nicest guys around, and one of them in particular just can't hack it there, and he kills himself because of it. So as punishment for the way that they treated him, the bullying that was going on, they are sent out to do a kind of team-building exercise to avoid these things in future, and also to try and prepare them for the outside world if they do ever get out of prison again, by sending them to this island. And it's an island which was used previously for army training, SAS, that kind of stuff. And the movie is set in England, English actors, etc., etc. And the type of violence and the type of brutality actually makes that very obvious. I mean, if the accents didn't already, British horror, in a similar way to Korean horror and French horror, has a very specific flair to it. And I really like it, because I think that British horror is very savage. It has a brutality to it, again, in a similar way to the other countries that I mentioned, and also Australia has a similar kind of violence as well, where it's not stylized. It's made to look aggressive and painful and ugly and dirty and brutal. And I love it for that. It works really well. And again, I'll go back to the old Green Room comparison, because although that's not a British movie, it's got that same kind of vibe to it, where it's got this savageness to it, and it works well, especially in a survival horror thriller. I would say perhaps even better than any other kind of scenario, in fact. Now, in this particular movie, as I said, they end up on this island, and things begin to kind of go wrong. They begin being picked off, and some of them come back, some of them don't, and they're going to figure out what's going on. Who or what are they being hunted by? Now this is the kind of movie that could easily be awful with that kind of premise, but it was so refreshing to see that they actually put effort into it. Which unfortunately, as I said earlier, is far more than can be said about the marketing department, but as far as the acting goes, I thought it was great across the board. There are characters who feel real. Obviously, living in the UK myself, I've seen plenty of people who are similar to the ones in this film. Not necessarily quite as extreme in some cases, but certainly similar. And even the characters who you love to hate give a great performance. I mean, after all, that's why you love to hate them. And they're not stereotypical either. You could initially think, if you've seen the film, well actually they kind of are, but not really. They're actually not stereotypical characters. A number of characters who have certain, for instance, gender roles in the film are flipped on their head. Certain characters who are supposed to take the lead aren't really manning up to it, as the saying goes. Certain other characters who are maybe not as obvious to be a leader step up. So it's actually not cliched. All the characters have kind of their own little arc in a funny kind of way, or these little interpersonal relationships, and be it good or bad with others, that change them throughout the film. And in a similar way to Predator, it sorts the men from the boys, in effect. It sorts the survivors from the prey, and that's exactly what you want a survival thriller horror to do. And this movie, I think, does a really good job of that. Now, as far as the scores, I'm going to kick it off first of all with a 6 out of 10 for the story and the plot. And the reason why I'm giving it a 6 out of 10 is because it's very well done, it's justified, it's well carried out, of course, as I've mentioned. But at the same time, as I've alluded to with other films, it just wouldn't be fair to rate it a 7, an 8 or a 9, because there are other films which I would put at that level which are more complex, or maybe even better carried out than this one was. Now, a 6 out of 10 is not bad. That's above par. Par would be a 5. So I'm not saying that it's basic or bad by any means. It's actually good. It was easily better than I was expecting. I was going into it not even expecting actually to do a review. I thought it was going to be awful. So it was such a pleasant surprise. I've seen the movie a couple of times actually now. So a 6 out of 10 for me, I think, is quite fair for this movie. Now, as far as the characters go, the portrayals, the way they're written, the way they act, I'm going to give it a 7. And the reason why is fairly self-explanatory. They were good. And as I mentioned just now, the performances were good. The characters themselves and the way they're written could very, very easily have been way over the top. And yet it doesn't feel over the top, even though a number of the characters, not too surprisingly for young alpha males, or at least would-be alpha males in a prison environment, of course they are big and loud and bombastic and trying to dominate the scene, and yet the way they're directed, the way they're written, and the way that the performances are given by the actors, it actually helps to really ground it. It makes what could so easily be over the top believable. And I have to shout that out. It's such a respectable thing for a film that is barely talked about like this one. So it's great. It's an easy 7 for me. The reason why I'm not going even higher is because some of the characters in the film aren't necessarily utilised, I think, in the best way. Some of them are literally wasted, but it's a forgivable thing. It's not bad by any means. And I do feel, and this kind of ties into the story as well, that without spoiling anything, the ending feels a little bit rushed for me. And that's something which I can actually identify with in the way that I write. I will often, especially when I was younger, write things in such a way where I put a ton of thought into the build-up and into the reveal, but then I would often rush the ending because I just wanted to get it done and get it finished. That's kind of like what this movie feels like. The ending is a little bit rushed. It does have a Predator-esque vibe to it, which is cool, but it still feels a little rushed from the character side of things, especially given the importance that relationships have in a lot of different ways building up to the ending. But again, it's not an awful thing, and that's not really down to the actors, that's more the writing side of things. So the performances were great, the characters were very interesting, you love to hate some, you root for some, you're not sure about some. It's a great mix, and they all have great chemistry as well, and I don't mean that they get along, they just have great chemistry, period. Now, as far as the visuals, the effects, gore potentially in a survival film called Wilderness with teeth on the front of the DVD cover, well yeah, it's good. I'm going to give it another 7. And the reason why is because, well, it's actually a fairly simple one. It's good. There's good gore in the film. There is thankfully more gore than there is blood, which is always a plus for me, because blood gets boring very quickly. Having a red screen doesn't really do it for me, whereas gore, there's something beautiful about gore in a melancholic, kind of morbid way, where you don't want to look at it, or at least some people don't, and yet you still have to. And for those of us who do like gore, it gives you so much to work with. The kind of gore that you could just pause the movie and appreciate for a moment, not just for the sake of, oh, I like seeing people torn up. It's much deeper than that. I'm talking about even from a filmmaking perspective, the kind of effort that goes into moments of gore which might only even be on screen for like half a second, and yet it takes weeks, if not months, to develop the makeup and the effects that go into that one moment. And of course you could say that about any film with gore, but that's kind of the point. It's movies like this and others which make you appreciate that if you choose to think about that, because the kind of effort that goes into filmmaking, it's incredible, especially when it's something that's only on screen for a few seconds. And this movie does give you some nice, well-lit shots to appreciate the gore. So I really like that, so it's a pretty easy 7 for me. As far as the audio, the soundtrack, I'm going to give it a 6. The soundtrack I thought was okay, not overly memorable, but it does the job. It's got some good kind of speedy vibes to it, pumping up the mood sometimes or adding to the tension, but nothing to write home about, nothing incredibly mind-blowing, for sure. And finally, for the fun factor, for the rewatchability, for the group rewatchability potentially, or just the entertainment on the first viewing, well, for that one, I'm going to give it another 7, actually, because I watched it twice, I believe it is now, and as I've said before on the channel, I don't tend to watch these movies that I review all that many times. Usually I'll watch it, well, obviously once, sometimes twice, rarely more than that unless it's one of my absolute favourites. On this occasion I watched it twice, and I did definitely find that I enjoyed it more the second time. So if that can happen, that's always a good sign. So you're probably wondering why only a 7? Well, I think the reason why is because it's the kind of film where, because there's not really as much of an importance on the mystery aspect, there is mystery in the film, but not really. You can probably work out a lot of the stuff that's going to happen, even as far as who's going to die and who isn't, but it's just not the kind of film that I'm going to rewatch all the time. I've watched it twice. That was probably good enough for me. I might check it out a third time, but I feel like it's the kind of movie that you'll get most of what you want out of it, out of the first and then the second viewing, sometimes maybe even just the first viewing. So for me, again, it just wouldn't be fair to rate it stupidly high compared to films that I would happily watch, say, once a month or even once a week. So overall, as far as all of the scores tabulated together, I'm going to give Wilderness a perfectly respectable score of 3.3 out of 5, which might not sound super high, but that's actually pretty good. That's a decent enough score for a movie which I would say definitely deserves actually to be talked about more. There's some great horror imagery and gore, a survival vibe. Performances are fantastic. I cannot stress enough how much better the characters in this movie are than what you would typically expect from the horror or thriller or survival genre. My most common gripe is dumb characters who make stupid decisions and just aren't believable. They serve no purpose beyond being fodder. In this movie, every death actually means something, in a similar way to John Carpenter's The Thing, where because you get enough time to actually see most of the characters for enough screen time to at least have some connection to them, and I don't necessarily mean that you like them, even ones that you dislike, you get a reason to dislike them. In a similar way, Wilderness does that as well, so that even if you don't like the person who died or necessarily wanted them to live, it still has more of an effect than just a nameless extra or some stupid comedic role who you know is going to die immediately. It's much deeper than that. And I would say that the performances, definitely including Toby Kebbell, were great. They definitely carry the film, and the rest is just a nice bonus, actually. Overall, it's a really well-made survival thriller, definitely an undervalued one. If you're a fan of this kind of genre, definitely check it out if you haven't already. It's a gem, for sure. But that's it for this pick overall. Of course, I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.